Thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be here with all of you at the Academy and to be working with so many of my mentors and colleagues that I look up to and have had just incredible careers and have been teaching me for so long in this, and to be able to share this message with you is really an honor. So I'm going to talk about the effects of changing drug policies and give somewhat of a landscape of what's happening in the United States and also elsewhere. So just a bit about the organization very quickly, SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana. I started this with Congressman Patrick Kennedy when I left the White House in 2011 as an evidence-based scientific approach to marijuana policy, rejecting what I call a false dichotomy. Let me get to that first. Here we go. A false dichotomy saying that we really only have two choices for marijuana, legalization or incarceration. This is often, what we're taught is that you either have a war on drugs where you focus on criminalization and stigmatization, or the only alternative must be legalization. And we set forth to create a bipartisan scientific-based group that really wanted to challenge that notion and to really challenge the notion that legalization, certainly the way that it is inevitably unveiling itself in the United States, where it's much more prevalent than anywhere else in the world, that is not without its costs, and we have to point out those costs. So let me go back a little bit. We like to remind we're trying to remind the world, and of course in America, because probably this was ground zero in the last century for this, of the early days of big tobacco. That, it wasn't that long ago when we had companies talking about asthma cigarettes for your health, and that we had more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, or we had prevention ads from Philip Morris saying that you should smoke Philip Morris because that's good for you, and it's actually beneficial. We have to give Dr. Batty here some credit, because at least his company said, you can't really read it from your seat, but it said, not recommended for children under 6. So I guess that's good. But the incredible thing is that this was accepted. It was accepted by the medical profession, it was accepted by the US government, and by all world governments, even though the first evidence of tobacco causing harm published in a journal was not in the 1960s or 1970s, but actually in Germany in the 1920s. But it took over 80 years for that research to be accepted. And I sometimes feel like we're in a time warp, we're sort of back in time with cannabis and this issue, that we are in 1925, when we have evidence, we already have enough evidence to at least say that we should discourage use. But in reality, very powerful corporate forces combined with government are essentially producing the situation we're in today. We have all the evidence from the tobacco companies. This is just one snippet. As you know, when the US settled a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit with the tobacco companies, part of the condition was a release of all their private papers. So going through those papers, we know that, for example, major tobacco companies, in this case the former company called Brown and Williamson, had plans for apple-flavored cigarettes, sweet-flavored cigarettes, honey-flavored cigarettes, things that could target youth and young people. Because if we can learn anything from the great presentations today, it's that our brain is developing until age between 25 and 30. That means our preferences are developed when we are young. You will not find someone addicted to drugs who started their drug use after age 25. You may find one or two, but the reality is this is something that happens when you're young, and your preferences are formed when you're young. So it's important, if you're in the industry, to target the young, because that's the only way you're going to make money. Many people think big tobacco is gone because we don't have the Marlboro Man anymore, because we don't have Joe Camel. But as Newsweek reminded us late last year, I think we can safely say it's back in many forms. It's back not only in the e-cigarette vaporizing industry, but also it is back around the world. This is a small snippet. Here's Marlboro a couple of years ago selling baby clothes in West Africa. We've all seen the ads in Asia, those of us who've been to Southeast Asia, and the incredible amount of marketing there. The tobacco industry is taking root in the developing world already and provides community centers, provides places of congregation, and really is a prominent force, even if we don't see their advertisements as much in the West, is a prominent force in the developing world. So they haven't gone anywhere in terms of their footprint in the world. They've just sort of moved around. What's amazing is that we know that the tobacco industry is also interested in marijuana. In the 1970s, a consultant report revealed, and this was part of the papers that were revealed to the world, the consultant report essentially revealed that the use of marijuana has important implications for the tobacco industry in terms of an alternative product line. It's not surprising that, you know, these are both companies that produce something that is from a plant, that process, that market, that package. It would make sense that the tobacco industry and the marijuana industry would come together. In fact, I don't have the slide up here, but the third largest tobacco company in the world, which is Japan Tobacco International, has teamed up with a Silicon Valley startup about 5 years ago to produce the first vaporizer that actually vaporizes both THC and tobacco. So we now have vaporizing products from the tobacco industry that vaporize high concentrated marijuana. So I do think, and I think it's very important, and I appreciate Professor Maldonado's emphasis on separating these issues, because part of the, and Dr. Madras talked about this too, and so did Bob DuPont, is that part of the confusion comes with the mixture of these issues, of this idea of decriminalization, this idea of medical use, and this idea of legalization. And it's difficult to have a clear conversation because on purpose, the legalization lobby mixes these things up. So in the United States, we hear calls for legalizing marijuana because kids with epilepsy need CBD. Now, that makes about as much sense as saying legalize heroin because some people need morphine. It doesn't make any sense. But with the level of knowledge of this being very, very low in the US, and with sort of internet and social media, I think, manipulating a lot of what's going on, it's very easy to confuse these issues. And I think part of the reason we're in such a strange place internationally right now with marijuana policy specifically is because of these melding of all of these issues that really do need to be separated. And I obviously don't have time to go through all three of the issues, but I'm going to mainly focus on issue number 3, legalization. You've heard a lot about how in America we've legalized marijuana in so many states, 28 states, that this is something that is a sort of inevitable march. And I think what's interesting is to remember that unlike alcohol prohibition, marijuana is not used by the majority of people. So alcohol prohibition in the 1920s was a law imposed on what 70% of people were doing almost every week. So 70% of people were drinking, and a law came and said you couldn't do that anymore. That's why the law couldn't last. We're now in a very different situation, a peculiar one, where an activity that 8 to 9% of people partake in has been agreed upon by 55% of people. And that's very, very different than alcohol. But what's interesting is when you go deeper into these opinions, whereas a lot of Americans do think legalization is inevitable and we shouldn't have mandatory sentences and we should focus on treatment, many of them are very bothered by the idea of public use, by the idea of candy, of marijuana, by the idea of storefronts, by the idea of advertising. And so we're in this place where we are going towards legalization in a very loose, open way, but I'm not sure if that model can last as it gets more popular and as it gets more adopted, because I think people are going to say that this was not exactly what they signed up for. What's interesting internationally is that most of the EU countries, when you ask public opinion, completely oppose legalization, even youth in the EU. In fact, this is a chart showing that really only 6 or 7 EU country youth approve of legalization. In Latin America, it's even more one-sided. The Latin American public sees drugs as a mix between security and public health, and legalization is a deep minority position in Latin America. The vast majority of countries, and you're looking at countries like Peru that show 94% disapproval of marijuana, it is a minority opinion, and yet we are being told by former presidents and by legalization commissions that this is a foregone conclusion worldwide, and that the majority of people want to legalize drugs. We're actually not seeing that in all of these other countries. Even in a country like Canada, whose popular government has embraced legalization, the support for legalization is split. It's really at a 48-48 and then some undecided. It's not a majority opinion. I think the worry that we see these legal markets producing is something we did not see in the underground market, and this is amazing. So this is innovation by American business, not Colombian cartels, not Mexican drug gangs. Mexican drug gangs did a lot of destruction, but they didn't create marijuana gummy bears. They didn't create marijuana candy and soda. And they didn't create chocolates and the innovation that comes with a legitimate legal industry. So I worry, and this is really a long presentation I'm summing up in this slide, I worry about 5 things happening with legal marijuana in the United States. First is the kid-friendly items that come in very attractive shapes and colors. And one question was, can't we restrict that, or what can we do? The history of restricting that, the recent history, is abysmal. Going against an industry is very difficult. Number 2, we now have potencies of up to 95% THC products that are vaporized. Compare that with the chart that Nora and others have shown regarding average THC of smoked marijuana at 12%, or 10 years ago at 6%. And it's a totally different drug in my book. We have absolutely no idea what a THC concentrate does to a developing brain or an adult brain. Number 3 is another big worry I have, which is aggressive marketing. We now have multiple states that allow essentially free samples, billboard advertising, and some of them have laws against billboard advertising, but they don't enforce them usually. Other, what I call big tobacco tactics. Very interestingly, and this was a question earlier I think Carla asked, Ms. Rossi asked about the sort of purity and also knowing what is in marijuana. The contaminants found in legal, regulated marijuana are incredible. In Colorado alone, hundreds of thousands of individual products have been recalled from the legal market because of they contain banned pesticides and additives that are illegal in most things. And finally, this special lobby. We have now created a special interest lobby that attends meetings like this that look very presentable. They're not smoking marijuana when they're talking. They have Ivy League and educations. They are lawyers. They are PR specialists that specialize in fighting regulation. And in Colorado, even when our colleagues went to the industry and the lawmakers and said, can't we reduce the THC level because it's legal? Can't we not sell the gummies? Can't we not target kids? They are rebuffed at every turn because they are outfunded, and they are outfunding the prevention and advocates and parents. They are outfunding the religious advocates, and they are very, very well organized. And none of this was here before legalization. This is not a inherent sort of part of the drug market that you have dangerous drugs whether they're legal or illegal. This is only because they're legal. And when I show parents a picture of what a 98% THC vaporized product looks like, they think this is heroin. I mean, the idea that this is marijuana, that this is a plant, is incredible to people who have not been exposed to this in years. So it's really birthed a marijuana industry funded by private equity, fueled by private equity and Wall Street. These are just 2 examples of the financial firms. We're asked a lot, who are these people? Who are these financial firms? Well, They are global networks. They are multinational organizations. They are legitimized in countries now like Uruguay and Canada, and they are exporting drugs even to other countries. A Canadian medical marijuana company just announced a major export project with Brazil, which does not even have legal marijuana but gets around rules under medical. So right now, Washington State and Colorado have more marijuana businesses than McDonald's, hamburgers, fast food restaurants, or Starbucks. And in Colorado, they have more than those two combined. So obviously, this is much more prevalent. We saw and heard Nora talk earlier about the prevalence of youth marijuana use and how that is indeed stable in the United States. That's stable when you look at the entire country as a whole. When you mix Mississippi and Montana and Alabama with California, Colorado, and Washington, yes, it's stable. When you take the states that have looser marijuana laws out and you look at the US average versus Colorado and Washington, it's a very different picture. Colorado is now the #1 state in the US for youth marijuana use. Washington has had slower growth of use. But the rate is higher than and rising faster than the national average for both the general population and the young person population, 12 to 17-year-olds. Heavy marijuana use has surged among those in drug treatment. So those self-reporting people going to treatment, reporting how much marijuana they use. And let me tell you, trying to find data for Colorado and Washington is like searching for diamonds. I mean, it's very difficult to do because there has been no systematic data collection at all, even though it was promised by the leaders. And so we've had to pick and choose from whatever we can get from the public authorities. We have had to demand through Freedom of Information Act requests, we've had to demand data, and it's very difficult because now the states are in the business of defending their policy. So the state does not have a incentive to hand over data that show increases in use. So we're not only fighting the companies, we're often fighting, I think well-meaning, but still politicians and government officials who don't want their state to be seen in a bad light. More Colorado youth, this is brand new data, we just released this last month. More Colorado youth on probation are testing positive for marijuana since legalization. These are 15 to 17-year-olds, and then in red, 10 to 14-year-olds. In elementary and high schools, there are more marijuana offenses since legalization, growing from 1,700 to 2,300. In Washington State, traffic fatalities more than doubled after legalization, and this was a study by AAA Traffic Safety Foundation, not by any partisan group. This is the most prominent traffic safety group in the country. One part that I really think is very important to emphasize, and it's not being emphasized at all, is that these businesses are concentrated in poorer neighborhoods and in neighborhoods of color. I mentioned that today earlier in one of my comments, but here's a graphic that illustrates this. The orange and white are communities of color. These are Black and Hispanic communities in the city of Denver, which is by and large not extremely diverse, but where it does have racial minorities, they're on the edge of town, literally. You look at the dots, the red and the purple here, they represent the number of marijuana stores in the community. And you see a complete correlation between the poorer communities and of color and the communities where the marijuana stores are concentrated. What's fascinating is that we were told there would be fewer arrests if you legalized marijuana, that a benefit would be fewer kids being in the trap of the criminal justice system. Actually, what's happened in Colorado after legalization is a 5% increase so far. And let me caveat all this by saying this is still a relatively new policy. We're still learning. We have a lot more to learn. I think we're going to, over time, learn a lot worse. But the early indications are, in my mind, very troubling. We have a 5% increase in young people being arrested, and that is seen between Hispanics and Blacks. Actually, there's a reduction in white kids being arrested, but an increase in Blacks and Hispanics. And the main reason is that kids think this is legal for them, so they are bringing it to school. They are publicly using marijuana. All of those things are illegal. And it's amazing because the public was sold on them being decreed. Now, people are talking about what happened 2 weeks ago in the election. So 3 states have certified legalized marijuana. 1 state, Arizona, rejected it. And actually, Maine is still undecided. There is a difference in votes by 0.005%. No, 0.05% difference in voting. So 0.05%. With between yes and no. So that, I think that's going to be a longer slog there. But what did pass is fascinating. So Nevada, for example, does not allow cities to ban marijuana stores in their communities. And that's very important because in Colorado, 2/3 of local cities have banned the sales of marijuana. You can't buy, it's illegal to have a marijuana store because the local cities have voted against them. In Nevada, they wrote the law, they said you can't ban them. The other thing they did in Nevada was allow the alcohol industry to come to market for the first 18 months alone. So the alcohol industry in Nevada will distribute marijuana for the first 18 months. And a lot of other things that are very business oriented. The Massachusetts initiative gives 9 out of the 15 advisory board members controlled by, more or less controlled by the marijuana industry. I mean, you're not an expert in marijuana product manufacturing if you're not in the industry. And those are the kinds of things that they call for. Attorneys associated with the industry. 9 out of the 15 people making the rules will be from the industry. All of these initiatives allow candy, chewing gum, lollipops, soda, ice cream, and all of them allow the concentrate, which is the 95%. So none of them learned. You know, I wish I could say, well, you know, we sort of learned from Colorado and now we're going to do things better. That's not the case. It's not about learning. It's about one thing and one thing only, and that's making money. And I figured I'd show some marijuana-infused Nutella because we are here. These are the kinds of advertisements and products that are going on. $1 joint with purchase. A massive billboard advertising a vaporized 98% marijuana in Colorado. This is supposed to be illegal. This is supposed to be not allowed, but there's no way the state can enforce these rules that they put out. All of the cartoon characters and things like that. So I actually want to skip ahead a bit. I think it's a problem. And what's amazing is that this is not brought on by the evil drug cartel leaders of Mexico or Colombia. This is brought on by people who, you know, seem to be decent. You would think, you know, they have Yale business degrees. They have Harvard law degrees. They are wizards in financing. And I think that is the most scary part, is that the drug dealer, the drug cartel leader that we think looks one way actually looks very differently. And that's, I think, one of the most deceiving things. I'm not going to be able to go into details of decriminalization, but I do think it's interesting. The point I want to make about decriminalization is that we need to understand the nuances of those laws. They're so different throughout Europe and different states in the United States in terms of what they allow and what they don't allow. And there's some new data we've been working on looking at different countries in Europe that have a de facto, you could say, possession legal, de facto decriminalization and illegal. Not a big difference between decriminalization and illegal, but when you look at the countries like the Netherlands and Spain that have more widespread use, I think you do see more interesting increases. But that's something we have to look at. In the United States, you see the same thing. If you look at so-called lenient decriminalization laws, the rates are much higher than the strict decriminalization laws. The point being, not all policies are the same, and we do need to look at different things. The final point I want to make is that we have to understand that this is not about marijuana. And that seems strange for me to be saying that because this entire discussion is about it. But the reality is the organizations and people involved in the legalization of marijuana worldwide they have been very clear that the end game is not marijuana, but is actually all drugs. And it's not decriminalization. They sort of use decriminalization, but then they use legalization interchangeably. The reality is a market for cocaine, synthetics, heroin, etc. And when you look at these drug reform groups, you look at the Open Society Foundations, you look at the steps that they are taking, like revising the UN drug conventions, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which acts like a UN body. I mean, that's what people think they are. These new commissions in West Africa and Latin America, they're funded by one or two people, the same people, and they have the same goals. First, starting as decriminalization and public health, which most of us would agree. We don't want to throw drug users in prison. But then moving very fluidly to this idea of regulation, which sounds very nice, which is really legalization. And if you look at even the complex web of funding, it's hard to see on the screen, but in California alone, 2 people through about 15 different organizations, some of which had the exact same name, just kind of a difference in spelling, more or less, funded $19 million to legalize marijuana in California. But they didn't want it to look like only 2 people, so you had to create 15 different organizations. This is an example of what we are seeing worldwide, of 2 or 3 main foundations and organizations under 20 to 30 different names doing the same thing. And they are getting prominent former presidents, as you know, and prominent people to start with the idea that this is a public health issue, which many of us would agree it is, but slide very quickly to legalization/regulation. So finally, I think we need a prevention and awareness program similar to what the very effective anti-tobacco campaigns have been. The anti-tobacco campaigns didn't really say tobacco is bad for you. What it did say was tobacco executives want your money. And when I tell 14-year-olds that marijuana is bad for your mental illness and your learning and your this and your that, they don't believe me and they don't care to listen. But when I tell them that there's an industry that wants their brain and sees their brain as a dollar sign, they don't like it. They resent that, and they want to learn more. And I think we can learn something. I hope we don't have to follow the same path as tobacco. That took us over 100 years to actually realize there was a problem. I hope we can learn earlier than that. But I worry that especially in the West and in the United States, we're following a path that is eerily similar to where we were with tobacco 100 years ago. And other models of legalization, even if we say they might be better or worse, are just not relevant because they're not being funded. The funded model is what I would call addiction for profit. It's a corporate model that centers on hooking young people early and commercializing this product. So I think we need to follow like what the Truth Campaign and other groups have done to actually spread awareness. The solution is obviously much more complex to everything. We need a balanced policy, smart enforcement, recovery, intervention, and treatment, all the things we talked about. But doing all of these things in an environment where you have lobbyists saying the opposite and you have advertising producing an environment that is encouraging use is, I think, going to be very difficult to do. And I think all of us need to speak out on this because we are being outsmarted and outwitted at every turn by a very, very, very well-funded lobby that wants to obscure the science, that wants to make one study that might show something positive for them as if that is the final word, and really is distorting the truth on this. So that's all I have. Our website is learnaboutsam.org. We have all kinds of infographics and other things on there for you, and my personal email is there. And I thank you for your time today. Thank you so much.